Johnny Carson wasn't just the king of late night, he was a one-man economy. Over 30 years of hosting The Tonight Show, he built a staggering $300 million empire, making him the highest-paid man in the history of television. He had the world at his feet and enough wealth to sustain his family for generations. Yet, when the curtain finally closed, his sons were left with a shocking reality. Despite the mountain of cash, the Carson fortune vanished right from under them. Behind that famous grin, Carson was orchestrating a secret plan for his millions, one that his heirs never saw coming. It wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't an oversight. It was a cold, calculated move that left the industry stunned. What could drive a father to work that hard, only to ensure his own blood couldn't touch a single cent of his empire? The truth involves a massive secret redirect of his fortune and a family dynamic far more fractured than the studio lights ever showed the world. Behind the mahogany desk, the cold reality of Johnny Carson's family life. Why Johnny Carson refused to leave behind anything for his children is a question that points to the hidden, icy reality behind the most famous grin in television history. While he was building a staggering $300 million empire as the undisputed king of late night, Carson was also orchestrating a final act that would leave his heirs stunned. He wasn't just a comedian, he was a one-man economy who established the very blueprint for everything we see on TV today. Born in Iowa and hardened by service in the Navy during World War II, Johnny's rise was a relentless climb from radio stations in Nebraska to the bright lights of Los Angeles. By the time he took over The Tonight Show in 1962, he wasn't just hosting a program, he was taking control of the American bedtime routine. For 30 years, he sat behind that mahogany desk, wielding a level of influence that no politician could ever dream of. But while the world saw a warm, charming host, his role in developing political humor was far more calculated. Johnny understood that to stay on top, he had to be the ultimate gatekeeper. He pioneered a style of middle-of-the-road comedy that allowed him to poke fun at the powerful without ever picking a side. This was his secret weapon. During the Watergate era, while the news gave us the dry facts, Johnny gave us the punchlines that actually stuck. He made it okay, even trendy, to laugh at the president, effectively stripping away the mystery of the White House with a single raised eyebrow. He turned politics into personality-driven entertainment, making The Tonight Show a mandatory stop for any candidate who wanted to prove they were human enough to lead. If you couldn't survive the couch next to Johnny, you probably couldn't survive the scrutiny of the American public. As he moved the entire power center of the TV industry from New York to California in 1972, he became more than a performer. He was an institution. He created unforgettable characters like the bumbling Aunt Blabby and the all-knowing Karnak the Magnificent, using them to mirror the absurdities of the world. Yet the same man who won 4 Emmys and the Presidential Medal of Freedom was becoming increasingly distant from his own blood. The fractured family dynamic that viewers never saw was the driving force behind his decision to divert his fortune toward his own foundation rather than his son's. On May 22, 1992, 50 million people watched his final curtain call, unaware that the man who had shaped a generation's sense of humor was leaving behind a legacy that served his name but excluded his heirs. Johnny Carson didn't just invent the late-night format. He lived his life exactly like his show, carefully scripted, perfectly timed, and always ensuring that he was the only one who got to deliver the final, shocking punchline. The 26-year ban, Why Johnny Carson Erased. Joan Rivers from history. Johnny Carson didn't just invent the late-night format, he lived his life exactly like his show, carefully scripted, perfectly timed, and always ensuring that he was the only one who got to deliver the final, shocking punchline. But while he was busy protecting his throne from his own flesh and blood, he was also fighting a silent war behind the scenes with some of the biggest names in Hollywood. You see, the man we saw every night, the one with the infectious laugh and the friendly "Here's Johnny" intro, had a dark side that could freeze a career in its tracks. To Johnny, loyalty wasn't just a preference, it was a law. And if you broke that law, you didn't just lose a friend, you were erased from the history of The Tonight Show forever. The most famous casualty of Carson's cold shoulder was undoubtedly Joan Rivers. For nearly 20 years, Joan was more than just a guest. She was the chosen one. Whenever Johnny needed a night off, Joan was the first person he called to fill his chair. He publicly endorsed her, nurtured her talent, and essentially handed her the keys to the kingdom. Rivers believed she was the heir apparent to the late-night throne. But in the mid-'80s, when NBC stayed silent about her future and the Fox network came knocking with a massive offer for her own show, Joan made a move that would change her life and end her friendship with Johnny overnight. The sting didn't come from the competition, it came from the silence. Johnny didn't find out about Joan's new show from her, he found out from a press release. When she finally tried to call him to explain, Johnny didn't want to hear it. He hung up the phone, and in that moment, Joan Rivers was dead to him. He never spoke to her again. For the next 20 years, she was banned from the set that had made her a star. Rivers later realized that Johnny's anger wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. She felt he viewed her as property, a woman he had discovered who had no right to go up against him. To Johnny, it wasn't just business, it was a total betrayal of the king. But while Joan was cast into the outer darkness, there was another legend who Carson couldn't seem to get rid of, no matter how hard he tried. Enter Bob Hope. To the viewers at home, Johnny and Bob looked like the best of friends, two NBC titans sharing the stage. But behind the curtain, Johnny was counting the minutes until Bob would leave. Hope had a standing invitation to walk onto the show whenever he wanted, usually to promote one of his endless specials. He would walk out to his signature theme song, drop a few scripted jokes, show a highlight reel that was cut together with a rusty knife, and then scurry away. Johnny absolutely hated it. For a man who valued spontaneity, intelligence, and sharp wit, Bob Hope was a nightmare guest. Hope didn't do conversation. He relied on his writers for every single word, and as he got older, his guest spots became a painful ordeal. He couldn't hear the questions. He'd answer things out of order, and his surprise appearances were anything but. Johnny would see Hope's name on the schedule and groan, "Again?" Yet he felt he couldn't say no. Bob Hope was a primetime powerhouse who had been at NBC since 1950. Even the king of late night had to defer to the old guard, even if it drove him crazy. The rivalry between them was a battle of two different eras. Carson was urbane, hip, and quick on his feet. Hope was a relic of a different time, a man who refused to stop even when his body was failing him. Seeing Hope struggle on air was a wake-up call for Johnny. He once famously told his writers, "If I ever end up like that, guys, I want you to sht me." It was a brutal admission of his fear of losing his edge. Johnny wanted to go out on top, with his dignity intact, which is exactly why he walked away in 1992, while he was still the undisputed champion. Even after retirement, the tension remained. When NBC threw a massive 90th birthday bash for Bob Hope in 1993, Johnny agreed to appear, marking his only TV monologue after leaving The Tonight Show. But even then, he had one strict condition. He would only do it if he were the only one doing a monologue. He didn't want Bob to try and keep up and end up embarrassed. It was a rare moment of grace, but it didn't change the facts. Whether it was the property he felt he owned in Joan Rivers or the rival he felt forced to tolerate in Bob Hope, Johnny Carson's world was one of strict boundaries. He was a man who lived in the spotlight but kept his heart in the shadows, proving that in the kingdom of late night, the only person Johnny truly trusted was himself. He built a $300 million empire and a legacy that will never be matched, but he did it by making sure that when the curtain closed, he was the only one left standing on that stage. The boozy rows and silent stews inside the chaotic marriages of Johnny Carson. While Johnny was the undisputed king of the airwaves, his private life was a revolving door of love, heartbreak, and boozy rows that the studio cameras never captured. Behind the impeccable manners and the perfectly tailored suits was a man who desperately wanted connection, yet seemed to find it impossible to maintain. He didn't just have a complicated relationship with his colleagues and his kids. He had a legendary track record with the women who tried to share his life. Johnny Carson was married 4 times, and each marriage offered a new glimpse into the man behind the desk. A man who was often cool, remote, and emotionally detached, even when the cameras were off. It all started back in 1949 with his college sweetheart, Joan Jody Marill Wolcott. They were just 2 students at the University of Nebraska, full of hope and big dreams. Jody was a sorority girl, and Johnny was a Navy vet trying to make it in radio. They had 3 sons together, Richard, Christopher, and Corey. But the domestic bliss didn't last. As Johnny's star began to rise, the pressure cooker of fame started to crack the foundation of their home. Those who knew them described the marriage as tumultuous, filled with long silent stews of resentment and explosive arguments, often fueled by alcohol. By the time Johnny landed the biggest job in television in 1962, the marriage was over. It was a pattern that would repeat. As his career hit new heights, his personal life hit rock bottom. The tragedy of this era followed him for years, culminating in the heartbreaking death of his son Richard in a car accident in 1991, a loss that added a layer of permanent shadow to the Carson legacy. Next came Joanne Copeland, the woman who arguably had the biggest impact on his career. When they met in 1960, she was a stewardess and a TV host herself. At first, she was skeptical. She didn't want to associate with people on daytime TV, but they soon became inseparable. She was the one who pushed him to take the Tonight Show gig, even when he was terrified that the job would cost him their relationship. In a way, she was right. Joanne became Johnny's emotional conduit, taking the brunt of his work stress and his struggles with the bottle. She was there for the move to California, the rise to superstardom, and the transformation of late night. But being married to the king meant playing second fiddle to a television show that demanded everything. When they divorced in 1972, Johnny joked that she left him with nothing but a hairnet. But Joanne walked away with something far more precious: the original tapes of his early shows, which she eventually shared with the world to prove just how brilliant he was from the very start. The same year he divorced Joanne, he married Joanna Holland. It was a classic New York romance. He was flirting like a sophomore at a high-end club, and she was one of the highest-paid models in the city. Johnny was so smitten, he called her every single day at 4:30 p.m. for a year. But the move to California, which Johnny demanded, put a strain on their bond. Joanna wasn't interested in being his career coach like the previous Joanne. She wanted her own life. Once again, the temper that Johnny admitted came out when he drank began to sour the relationship. He confessed in a famous interview that instead of becoming a happy drunk, he became the exact opposite. By 1985, the third marriage had collapsed, leaving Johnny alone in his Malibu mansion overlooking the ocean he loved so much. But the story of Johnny's heart has a final, softer chapter. In 1987, he met Alexis Moss on the beach in Malibu. This time, things were different. Alex wasn't looking for the spotlight, and Johnny was finally ready to step out of it. They had a tiny private wedding with no cameras and no press, just a speakerphone so her parents could hear the vows. This was the woman who finally figured out how to live with the legend. Together, they traveled the world, with Johnny even learning Swahili for their trips to Africa. Those who knew him best said Alexis was the real love of his life. She was by his side through his retirement in 1992 and stayed with him until his final breath in 2005. It took 4 tries and millions of dollars in divorce settlements, but the man who was a stranger to his own children and a terror to his rivals finally found a quiet peace in the arms of the one woman who didn't want anything from him but his time. In the end, Johnny's story is one of a man who could command the attention of 50 million people but struggled to keep the love of just one. He built a $300 million empire on laughter and charm, but the silence in his private life was often deafening. From the boozy rows with Jody to the quiet beach walks with Alexis, Johnny's journey through marriage was a search for the same thing we all want: to be truly seen. But for the king of late night, being seen was a full-time job, and sometimes the man behind the desk was just as much of a character as Karnak the Magnificent. He left behind a world of comedy that he helped create, a foundation worth hundreds of millions, and a trail of broken hearts that eventually led him home. Johnny Carson might have been the king of late night, but in the end, he was just a man from the Midwest, looking for a reason to stay after the applause died down. He proved that you can have all the wealth and power in the world, but the greatest trick of all is finding someone who loves you even when the cameras stop rolling. But while Johnny finally found a quiet peace in his final marriage, there was one part of his life where the magic never quite worked. The Ghost of Late Night, why Johnny Carson's sons only knew him on TV. For 30 years, the world saw Johnny as the ultimate father figure. Warm, funny, and always ready with a kind word for the kids who visited his set. But behind the scenes, the reality was much darker. To his 3 sons, Chris, Rick, and Corey, Johnny wasn't a hero. He was a ghost. He was the man who was married to the show, a father who could charm millions of strangers but couldn't figure out how to talk to his own flesh and blood. The King of Late Night had a $300 million empire, but when it came to his family, he was emotionally bankrupt. This is the story of the Carson boys, 3 kids who grew up watching their father give the best of himself to a camera lens, leaving them with nothing but the leftovers of a man who didn't know how to be a dad. The trouble started early, rooted in a marriage to their mother Jody that was less of a home and more of a battlefield. Fueled by Johnny's heavy drinking, the house was filled with boozy rows and a cold silence that would last for days. When the divorce finally happened in 1963, Johnny tried to convince himself and the public that it was for the best. He told Playboy that his boys weren't negatively affected and that they were getting along fine. But the reality was that they were losing their mother and gaining a father who was becoming a global superstar. As the boys grew, they shied away from the limelight, inheriting what Corey called the privacy gene. They were watching the magic unfold from the wings, never allowed to step into the light with him. It was a life of luxury funded by a man who was physically there but emotionally miles away. Corey later explained that professionally, Johnny was the right man for the job at the right time in history, but the personal consequence was a family left to watch the magic from a distance. Christopher, the oldest, lived a life that was a strange mix of privilege and control. While Johnny bought him houses and cars and gave him an annual allowance of $35,000, that money came with a heavy price. There was a major rift between them that most people never saw. In a move that showed just how cold the king could be, sources say Johnny once ordered Chris to cut off his pregnant partner, Tanena Love Green, threatening to pull his financial support if he didn't. It was a brutal display of power. Johnny was using his fortune as a leash, proving that even as adults, his children were subject to his rules. Chris worked as a golf instructor, trying to build a life for himself, but he was always tethered to the man in the suits, a man who seemed to prefer writing checks to having conversations. Then there was Rick, the middle son, whose life was a tragic struggle to please a father who was never satisfied. Rick was an artist, a photographer who just wanted to be seen, but the relationship was volatile. In the 1970s and 80s, Johnny's alcoholism made him a mean and very angry drunk, leading to explosive situations. In 1987, at a massive party on the Queen Mary to celebrate Johnny's 25th anniversary at NBC, the tension finally boiled over. In front of the industry's elite, father and son engaged in a violent public screaming match. It was a rare crack in the affable Carson mask. When Rick died suddenly in 1991, falling from a road embankment while taking photos on California's Central Coast, the loss shattered Johnny in a way he couldn't hide. He didn't even attend the memorial service, claiming he didn't want to turn it into a circus. But the guilt was eating him alive. When he returned to the air 3 weeks later, he spent the final minutes of his show honoring Rick, showing his photos to the sound of blues music. It was a rare moment of public vulnerability, but for Rick, it was too late. Johnny would grieve for him until the day he died, haunted by the fact that he never knew how to be the father Rick deserved. Corey, the youngest, was perhaps the most vocal about the bittersweet reality of being a Carson. To Corey, the most painful part wasn't the arguments or the drinking, it was watching the show. He would see his dad on TV, absolutely captivated by every word a child guest would say. He'd watch Johnny laugh and engage with these little guests with a warmth he never showed at home. As Corey put it, what did they have that we didn't? 10 minutes of material. It's a heartbreaking thought that the only way to get your father's attention was to be part of his act. Corey eventually found his own path as a classical guitarist, but he never forgot the feeling of being unworthy in the shadow of a legend. He understood his father's foibles better than anyone, realizing that Johnny was simply the right man for the job, not the wrong man for the family. By the time the final Tonight Show aired in 1992, Johnny seemed to know he had failed. With Chris and Corey sitting in the audience, he offered a public apology of sorts. He admitted that being his offspring wasn't easy and said, "I hope your old man hasn't caused you too much discomfort." It was as close to an "I'm sorry" as the world was ever going to get. He even mentioned Rick, saying the evening would have been perfect if he were there. But even in that moment, the distance was clear. He was still the host, and they were still the audience. He had spent his life being married to the show, leaving his family to watch the magic from the outside. Johnny later told Barbara Walters that the sense of failure as a husband or father could be overwhelming. His friend Suzanne Plachette noted that the kids had legitimate complaints, but it was those very demons that made Johnny who he was. He was a man who lived for the applause of millions because he didn't know how to handle the quiet love of a few. He built a $300 million empire on his talent, but left his children to navigate a world where they were the kids of a legend, but the strangers of a father. In the end, the story of the Carson family is a reminder that fame has a high price. Johnny Carson might have been the king of late night, but in his own home, he was a man who couldn't find the right words. He left behind a world of laughter for us, but for Chris, Rick, and Corey, he left a legacy of silence and a $300 million redirected fortune that served as the final, cold exclamation point on a life spent chasing the magic at the expense of his own blood. He proved that you can own the night, but you can still lose your way in the dark when the studio lights go out. The reality of Johnny's life was a mass of contradictions. He was a little boy from the Midwest with impeccable manners who could also be a mean and angry drunk. He was a philanthropist who gave away millions but threatened to cut off his own son's support. This complex dynamic was the true engine behind the Carson empire. A man running toward the light of fame because he was terrified of what he might find in the quiet corners of his own heart. As we look back at the 50 million people who watched his final sign-off, we have to wonder, was the applause worth the cost? For Johnny, the show was everything. For his sons, it was the wall that kept them from the man they needed. Johnny Carson didn't just leave behind a show, he left behind a question about what it truly means to be successful. He owned the stage, the night, and the history of television. But as he sat in his Malibu home in his final years, learning Swahili and watching the waves, he was a king without a court, a father who finally realized that the greatest magic wasn't found in a studio, but in the family he had left behind. And that, perhaps, is the most human part of the Johnny Carson story. A man who had everything, yet realized too late that he had missed the very thing that mattered most. The legacy of the Carson boys remains one of quiet resilience. They inherited the privacy gene to defend against a world that saw them only as extensions of their father. Chris and Corey continue to live away from the cameras, carrying the weight of their father's demons while carving out their own paths. They are the living testimony of a man who was the right man for the job, but the wrong man for the home. In the end, Johnny Carson delivered his final punchline, but it was his children who were left to figure out what it meant. Why Johnny Carson refused to leave behind anything for his children. The king is gone, the show is over, and the laughter has faded, leaving only the complex, bittersweet memory of a man who gave the world everything but left his family with a silence that could never be filled. But as the dust settled on his $300 million empire, a new question began to circulate through the halls of Hollywood and the quiet streets of Malibu. Why would a man who worked that hard for that long seemingly decide to bypass his own blood when it came to the bulk of his fortune? It's the mystery that has kept fans and critics talking for decades, the truth behind why it appeared that Johnny Carson refused to leave behind anything, or at least anything substantial, for his children. When the curtain finally closed for good in 2005, the world learned that Johnny's one-man economy wasn't going where everyone expected. Instead of a massive windfall for his surviving sons, Chris and Corey, the lion's share of his life's work was funneled into the John W. Carson Foundation. We're talking about a staggering $156 million trust that eventually grew to over $200 million. While the public saw this as the ultimate act of generosity toward children's health and education in Los Angeles and Nebraska, those close to the family saw it as the final cold exclamation point on a lifetime of distance. Johnny wasn't entirely heartless, though. He did leave a portion of his estate to his widow, Alexis Moss, and his remaining sons, but it was a fraction of the mountain of cash he had built. Alexis also walked away with their massive 4-acre Malibu estate, which she sold a couple of years later for a cool $36.5 million. But the message was clear: the empire belonged to the Johnny Carson brand, not the Carson family. His former attorney, Henry Bushkin, once dropped a bombshell when he claimed that Johnny felt his children never gave him anything to be particularly proud of. It's a stinging remark that paints a picture of a father who valued professional excellence over personal connection. Yet, there was a glimmer of humanity in his final years. The tragic death of his son Richard in 1991 seemed to finally wake him up to what he had missed. Just a year later, he walked away from the camera for good. In his famous sign-off, he looked directly into the lens and told his boys he loved them, acknowledging that being the offspring of a legend wasn't easy. He spent his final 13 years living quietly, finally choosing privacy over the applause. Today, his legacy lives on through Jimmy Fallon and the hosts who followed. But for his sons, the real legacy is much more complicated. Johnny Carson was a man of humor and humanity on screen, but off camera, he was a king who ensured that his empire would serve the world long after his own family had faded into the shadows of history. He gave us the laughs, but he kept the truth and the fortune for himself. What are your thoughts on Johnny Carson's final act? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.